Bonjour, everyone. I'd like to start today by saying bonjour. Gidjagana Kodak Nadijnaka, Ajijak Nadodem, Minjikanin Danjiba, Nishnawbe Kwendao, Made Kwendao. Hello, everyone. My name is Out of the Clouds. If you happen to not be fluent in Anishinaabe, I'm also known as Amber Schilling. My family comes from Minjikanin, and I am the current senior manager at the Indigenous Research Support Initiative at UBC. So I would like to acknowledge that I am coming to you guys today as a very grateful uninvited visitor on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. So I would just like to say thank you for that, miigwech, and welcome. Thank you all for being here. So good morning. We are very excited to have you here. The topic of today's event is covering COVID, pandemic reporting in Indigenous contexts. Today's event partners are the UBC Learning Circle, the Indigenous Research Support Initiative, as well as the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We are very blessed to have a moderator with us today. Our moderator is Candis Callison. She is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Journalism and the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies and a member of the Tahltan Nation. Her research and teaching is focused on changes to media practices, platforms, journalism ethics, the role of social movements in public discourse, and understanding how issues related to science and technology become meaningful for diverse publics. She is also the co-author of Reckoning Journalism's Limits and Possibilities. So with that, I would like to say welcome and turn it over to our moderator for the day. Candis, take it away.
Medu, Amber. Shoshalona Hote. Good morning, and Tahltan. Talsadan de Dene, de Otsi, Cheskia, Esta, Sei. Candis Ushia. So my name is Candis. I'm from the Tahltan Nation and a member of the Crow Clan. And it is a wonderful day here on Musqueam land. I'm really pleased to be talking to you as a guest here on Musqueam land. Like many of us at UBC and like all of us in Vancouver as guests, uninvited and invited, on Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam lands. So I want to start with a little bit of a statement about what we're walking into here. The topics that we're covering today can be sensitive and emotional triggering, and in particular, we recognize that there is an ongoing pandemic and a lot of other issues in the world that are of great concern to many of us. So please make sure that you're looking after yourself. I want to acknowledge that our Black communities here in Canada and in the US have been under enormous strain, and many of our Indigenous communities have been working with them as well, and we stand together with them. So if at any point you feel that you need to talk to a friend, elder, counselor, or a family member, please don't hesitate to do so. So we're going to have two presentations today. They'll be about 10 minutes long, and then we're going to follow up with some Q&A with me, and then we're going to open it up to all of you who are joining us today. So please set your chat to all attendees and panelists, and stay for the Q&A that follows and participate. I also want to introduce our behind-the-scenes team. Cole Daly and Cynthia Lung from the UBC Learning Circle, Julie Gordon and Emily LeBaron from IRSI, which is the Indigenous Research, and I'm missing the S, Institute here at UBC. So it is my great pleasure to introduce two women who have made enormous contributions to our public discourse about Indigenous communities through their journalism. First, I want to introduce Angela Sterritt, who is a journalist from the Gitxsan Nation. She has won a lot of awards for her work for CBC. She has a column called Reconcile This, which explores the tensions between Indigenous people and institutions in BC. She has a book that's on its way. She's given TED Talks and just generally really contributed to our understanding of what Indigenous communities have been experiencing both historically and in the present, and what our futures look like together. Our other panelist is Stephanie Wood, who is a graduate of the journalism school where I teach. She is currently a journalist living and writing in North Vancouver and working for the Narwhal, which is a organization that I know quite a bit about since I'm on the board of. She writes about Indigenous rights, the arts, sustainability, and social justice. She has also had her work appear in the Tyee Media Indigena, which I also participate in, CBC and CITR, as well as the National Observer. So welcome to both of you. I'm so glad that I get to be in conversation with you for the next little while. I'm going to ask Angela to go first and talk to us about her approaches to reporting on COVID.
Thank you so much, Candis. I'm really excited to be here today. And I also want to put it out there that we understand what's going on in the world right now in terms of a lot of trauma and a lot of hurt and a lot of thinking on the part of non-Black people, but also addressing and thinking about what our Black community members are going through in Canada right now, and just wanted to address that. And it's definitely been a learning curve I've witnessed in my own workplace and in my own self, learning about how to speak about this, how to make space, how to listen. And these are difficult conversations that we're having, and just want to acknowledge that that this is going on, and this is difficult. These are difficult times, and in particular for Black community members. So in terms of reporting during the pandemic, I mean, for me, it's basically shone a light on all the gaps and the inequalities. When I first started reporting at the beginning of the pandemic, I was focusing on a lot of the pitches that come to me. I'm at a place in my career now where I'm often not looking for pitches. Pitches are just coming to me, and I'm sort of sifting through all of them. And since the pandemic hit, I don't know about other journalists, but there's just so much right now. And I'd say at the beginning, there was just a lot of like, oh no, from like the stories that I was working on. In particular, there was one that I worked on about children not being able to see their foster children, not able to see their biological parents, and a lot of fear around that, and a lot of people feeling really isolated. The big story that I found right at the very beginning of the pandemic, which I found really challenging in terms of being Indigenous and being a journalist, was I saw a lot of people say, we're still gonna go to sweat lodges, we're still gonna go to ceremony. And I was like, what? Like, as soon as the pandemic hit, as a journalist, I thought, okay, this is gonna be a really great time to shine a light on the leadership of Indigenous communities who've been through smallpox, the Spanish flu, TB, and I thought we'd see that leadership right away. And, you know, I would hear from people who'd say, you know, my elders are telling me that this is going to be hard, because what they learned from smallpox, for example, was the people who didn't socially isolate died, right? And so I thought I would hear a lot more of that. But what I started to find is that, again, we're seeing how impacted our communities still are by colonization. So I saw a lot of very Christianized missionary type of views starting to surface, like we can pray this away. I started to see that real mistrust of health authorities. You know, all the reporting that I've done, a lot of the reporting that I've done throughout my career is focused on the injustice that Indigenous feel in terms of the health system, all different types of institutions, but the health system in particular is particularly egregious. So we saw a mistrust of governments, a mistrust of provincial health authorities saying, you've got to stay inside, you've got to not, you know, be in a sweat lodge where it's the perfect environment for droplets to spread, and community members having to make these really difficult decisions. But this mistrust really came to the forefront, and also that trauma of having your cultural ceremonies being ripped away from you during colonization. All of that started to surface, but there was no time to really discuss how this was all unfolding. And so it was really hard to have those discussions in my own family and in my own community, and then also to report on them and to do it in a way that understood that the foundation of our reporting right now is based on the ever-changing and ever-evolving science, peer-reviewed reports, and the messaging from the health authorities, but also to say, okay, Indigenous voices are the forefront, as my reporting always has been. So I found all of that really, really challenging at the beginning of the pandemic, and you know, how to get messages out about health, but also understand that there's some real mistrust and there's some trauma. And again, shining a light on how the legacy of colonization is still ever present here. I've also found that there's a light being shone on inequalities. So one of the most interesting stories that I did was, I did a story with Marielle Interpella-Fond and Indigenous communities who were saying, because we don't have Indigenous rights, because we don't have sovereignty, because we don't have self-determination, we're seeing inequality ever present in our communities. So for example, communities that were erecting barricades in their communities were told by the province, you can do that as an extra measure, but we are the end of the day authority. And what we put in place is going to be binding. Whatever you're doing cannot at the end of the day have any, say, punitive measures. So if somebody, say a tourist comes in, and we saw that in communities like Old Crow, where a non-Indigenous couple came in, you know, flew in, decided that they were going to camp out there without talking to the community because they wanted to escape the fears that they had of COVID. And you saw a community that didn't have anything in place because of that lack of self-determination. So for example, in Haida Gwaii, where you're seeing that the barricades put up, at the end of the day, they can put those barricades up, they're allowed, that's what the province told me. But if they wanted to detain, arrest, physically turn someone back and put them on the ferry, they're not allowed to do that. It has to, at the end of the day, go through the provincial health authority. In terms of that, we're also seeing a lack of sovereignty in terms of having access to disaggregated data. So Indigenous communities have told me, if there's a community that's a 2-minute walk away, we want to know, and we should have the right to know if there's an outbreak. Indigenous Services Canada, even when I pressed them, said absolutely not. First Nations Health Authority, absolutely not. The only people who we're going to tell if there's an outbreak to is the community who is affected. And it's up to them if they want to communicate to the public. And the reasoning behind that goes back to stigma, because they're saying, you know, they've heard from individuals that they feel stigma, that if this information about there being an outbreak or cases in their community, then they can face stigma. But the Indigenous people that I spoke to, including community members in communities with outbreaks, have told me this has gone beyond stigma. This is about life and death. This is about us not having any ventilators in our community, about us not having you know, a hospital or a healthcare center. And we've seen deaths. We've seen, there was a death in Alert Bay. There was another death in another community that I actually don't have permission to talk about, that died of COVID recently. And so it's very interesting, the conversations that I've been having around that. So listening to community members who've collected their own data. And again, going back to, this is like reporting I've done for my whole career. So we saw, you know, the RCMP for years was not willing to release data about missing and murdered Indigenous women. They straight up refused. So you saw community members doing this sort of like tremendous effort, but it had to be very ragtag, going to community members, talking to people, and not having, you know, at the time, not having a missing persons bank, a data bank. And we're seeing that with the pandemic. We're seeing people, kind of Indigenous people, researchers doing this sort of ragtag effort, very patchwork, Modge Podge, I've heard that word used, of trying to find out where these cases are. And they found that there's just like the missing and murdered Indigenous women, that there's way more cases than were previously, or that are being reported right now by Indigenous Services Canada. So again, you're seeing a lack of equality, a lack of transparency, a lack of information about people's selves, and having a lot of those really challenging discussions. And today, you know, we're having a conversation that's very alive about racism, in particular about anti-Black racism, that I'm, you know, finding in my newsroom and other outlets. This is very new, you know. I think in February at CBC anyways, and other outlets, we had some wording around when we cannot use the word racism. And so these discussions are very difficult. So a lot of the reporting that I've done around the pandemic is related to the pandemic. A lot of it is related to the pandemic and Indigenous people. I've also found, though, because of the urgency of so many other stories that have come up, I've had to do a lot of non-Indigenous reporting. So reporting on things that affect everybody, like schools that are ever present, or reporting on prisons, which of course have an overrepresentation of Indigenous people. But in particular, when I reported on the Mission prison outbreak, no one was reporting on it at all. And those are hard stories, very hard stories to do for a number of reasons. But to you know, look at these numbers going up and up and see, you know, I think at the time, there was something like 12 prisoners, which is still a lot for a prison that has only 300 people, but there was no interest. I didn't see anybody reporting on that at the time. I think hyper-local media were reporting on that, but I didn't see any national work on that. So again, you know, a place where Indigenous people are overrepresented in the prison, was one of the focuses for me on that. And again, seeing underreporting, a lack of transparency, an inability for family members to get answers about that particular prison. And yeah, so again, now that's sort of moved into a different discussion. My reporting's I've been really focused on racism. So yeah, kind of going all over the place here, but like many people, it's been, you know, very day by day in the pandemic, and every day is a completely different day, and we don't know. It's a time of deep uncertainty, and when it comes to communities that have that uncertainty in their lives every day because of systemic inequalities, you're going to see more of that and more concern, and sometimes reporting that isn't as rigorous as it needs to be. So yeah, that's sort of a snapshot of the type of reporting that I've done at this time.
Madhu, Angela, yeah, it's been a really interesting journey, and appreciate so many of your contributions, especially what was happening in Mission. It really, I think, really shone a light on exactly the inequalities that you were discussing. So I'm going to give Stephanie the next bunch of minutes to talk to us about your approaches, and then we'll move to some Q&A and discussion between the three of us. And then we'll open it up to the wider conversation.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I just want to say that I am really, really honored to be here, like, alongside Candis and Angela, who are both who have acted as like mentors and role models for me. And as Candis was just saying, like, Angela's done so much important work covering the pandemic and how it impacts like families, prisons, schools, everything. It's been really important work. So yeah, I work at the Narwhal, where a lot of our work is really focused on the environment and industry. And so yeah, it's been really hard, just kind of logistically speaking to the same things, working from home, and also the fact that others are working from home. So those like essential people you're trying to contact, you know, like they're not at the office, and they're often not answering emails or phone calls. And while that can be really hard for my job as a journalist, it also just makes you reckon with the fact that like these Indigenous governments have a lot of other things that are top priority, and getting back to you is going to be lower priority a lot of the time as they're like scrambling to keep communities safe. And so that's been something that I've been kind of struggling with sometimes, is feeling a little bit limited that way, you know, not being able to go out in the field and just wanting to get out those important stories. So I was going to start with just kind of giving a couple examples of reporting on COVID at the Narwhal. So we were covering how COVID impacted the Wet'suwet'en Memorandum of Understanding and how it was initially delayed, kind of the challenges in completing it, and then eventually agreeing to the memorandum. And once again, kind of difficult to cover because especially in March when things were so crazy, and once again, offices were closed, and the Gidimt'en spokesperson, Molly Wickham, was literally like about to have a baby, and there's still all of the aftermath of the raid, and RCMP still occupying the territory. And so there was a lot of challenges in covering that. Just so much was going on. And then on top of that, one of the stories that we did was really industry focused and was talking about how Skitcheston was flooded with project referrals from industry and from the province. And that was right in the really sort of critical time, and also in mid-March and late March, when we were first swinging into lockdown, and people were really scrambling and just starting to work from home, and you know, grocery stores were empty. That really kind of panicky time. And First Nations, in terms of referrals, often only have 30 days to review and respond to these projects in order to get to have a say in what's happening with these projects on their territory. And the specific community was still just getting flooded with referrals. And often they only have, you know, these governments only have one person working referrals off the side of their desk. And so it was really a testament, just kind of what Angela was just speaking about like resources, how different the resources are for these First Nations governments compared to the provincial government and these corporations, which, you know, had enough people to kind of keep on inundating communities with these project referrals. And meanwhile, Skitcheston is not only handling referrals, but also handling food security, safety for community, garbage, PEE, and childcare and healthcare, and everything that a government does on top of just administrative tasks and land management. Like it's just so much for a small team to be doing with strapped resources. And this story really demonstrated that. And I can't remember exactly where I read this because I've been reading so much lately, but I read recently someone saying that, you know, like white people just won't think about Black and Indigenous people. Like so often it's just not that, literally just not even kind of being on your mind. And that was something that that my source at Skitcheston spoke to. She said basically these people who were passing on the referrals to them, they're just cogs in the government or corporate machine. But at the same time, all she wanted was for them to pick up the phone and call and ask, like, you know, how are you doing? Like, what is your capability? Who's working? Are you able to process these? And that literally never happened. And so that to me also just is really telling, and just speaking to the difference of the abilities to be able to just literally just keep that paperwork moving in these like times of emergency. And it really also put in perspective just how overloaded First Nations governments were at the time, because we tried to reach out to 20 different governments and were only able to hear back from 3 over the course of several days, because everyone was just so busy. But that story was also really kind of a special example of how stories can have impact, because after we published that story, proponents actually contacted Skitcheston to talk about changing their practices and extending deadlines, and it actually created a difference. So that was pretty incredible, like when we heard back about that, to see the real impact that story could have, and even on this kind of even on a smaller scale, to see that it actually kind of pushed a systemic norm just a little bit in one small example. And then one of the other stories that I did was about food security in First Nations and balancing food security and conservation, which once again is something that was already ongoing before COVID, trying to balance conservation, food security, especially in the midst of climate change and industry encroaching on lands. But it was specifically about how people were adapting due to COVID, and from getting groceries to also finding ways to safely harvest and safely fish. And was once again a hard story because you can't go to the communities once again where you really want to be able to speak with them in a more personal way. But yeah, that was a story that was important, like kind of close to my heart to write, but also really made me think more about how we frame stories as well, you know, not writing about how communities are floundering and don't know what to do and need saviors or anything like that, like about how people are being adaptive and innovative and asserting sovereignty in these times, and grounded in the fact that food insecurity didn't come out of nowhere, that it's grounded in a history of colonialism and grounded in a history of profiting off Indigenous peoples and territories, and really setting it in that context. And I was actually just listening to Media Indigena, like some older episodes, and an Indigenous historian was talking about how you talk about like early contact and when the bison were eradicated, and then history often just skips ahead to now, and it's like, and now communities are food insecure, and like, where'd that come from? It doesn't talk about everything in between, the industry and pandemics and racist policies that all created that, like that it didn't come out of nowhere. So yeah, those are just a couple examples of some of the reporting that we've done specifically around COVID in Indigenous contexts. And then I did want to kind of speak more broadly, I suppose, just about some bigger ideas. Is also something that I think that we're going to talk about later, and Candis and I kind of like touched on in our earlier phone calls we were preparing for this, was just about framing First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people as vulnerable so much of the time in the media. And there's not a problem with being in a vulnerable position, especially if it's the result of being targeted by policy. But to frame people as vulnerable also kind of feeds into that age-old colonial narrative of they can't take care of themselves, you know, like they are inept, and they can't set blockades in their communities. They don't have the authority to do that, you know. And we were kind of joking on the last call, like there's no good time to assert Indigenous sovereignty. It's like it's a pandemic, so it's not the time. Like, you know, like there's just it's never the right time. And so another thing that was on my mind too, is we talk about how the media is covering COVID, is also, you know, like, who do we need to be hearing from, especially in mainstream media? I've seen so much good work being done, but at the same time, you know, how are there not Indigenous people on more of those expert panels talking about COVID? You know, people who are literal experts in how pandemics affects people. And so often it's still just a group of people who are calling it unprecedented and not speaking to that history and that literal precedent that happened here on this land. And I have seen a lot of great features that do take that history into account, but I think it should be the case that every panel, or at least as much as possible, includes, you know, those knowledge holders and people who know the history and how communities survived. And, you know, just really kind of empowering those voices who really do have that knowledge, and not just acknowledging that the history exists, but actually exploring it and laying it out, you know, not just alluding to it. And I guess the last point I kind of wanted to sort of end on was just something that Candis would always bring up in class, you know, like, who does this serve? Who does this media serve? Like, and is something that also, like, Desmond Cole speaks to, is who does objectivity serve in media? You know, this ideal of objectivity that we all kind of know is not real, and is a facade. Like, we're all coming from a viewpoint, and you know, who does it serve to not, like Angela was saying, just use the word racism or racist? You know, like, who does it serve to not just use that word? You know, who does it serve to add an implied or literal question mark every time a racist act happens? and ask whether Canada is racist, or whether it is a discrimination, or whether it is systemic or not. Basically, who does the question mark serve? And that's something that I think is really important when we're talking about what journalism does. And I guess the only other thing I just wanted to mention before kind of wrapping up is also what we cover with urgency in the media. I've seen a lot of people talking about, racism as a pandemic and climate change as the biggest emergency that we're facing, and not covering those emergencies with the same kind of urgency, and how we could adjust journalism to cover those things with the same urgency that we cover COVID.
I do, Steph. Yeah, really powerful to think with so much of what you've both brought up. I think one of the big burdens for Indigenous journalists in particular is to deal with both the colonial past and the colonial present, and somehow make sense of how to move into what a future looks like with Indigenous people in it, right? And I think, this point that you raised about Indigenous people knowing how to respond to what's happening in their communities is so important, and I see that in both of your work. I wanted to talk a little bit about organizations that you work for and how that informs your approach and how you think about who the audience is that you're speaking to. So you both work for quite different organizations, right? The CBC, our public broadcaster with a public mandate, and the Narwhal, which is a relatively new digital news source and sort of focused on environmental issues, sort of how you think about your journalism fitting into those organizations, and where you see the challenges as well.
Angela, do you want to go first? Or?
Sure. Yeah, so that's always like when you're working in mainstream media, especially ones that collect metrics and data about who our audience members are. So we know at CBC, I'm not sure how much this has shifted over the last few years, but even from open houses that we do and who our biggest fans are, we know that they're older white people. And so I think that's a really good question. I was doing a story about Bonnie Henry. There was a leaked video that came in, and a bunch of the reporters said, "Oh, this is so cool." And I was like, record scratch. Not every, Gitxsan person or Indigenous person will think this is cool. So hold up, but also just hold up. Like, what is this? And the video was not in a feast hall. There was not hereditary chiefs there. It was a elementary school, and it was a symbolic naming and adoption into the school, which is very different than the Gitxsan Nation. So you saw a lot of, and we didn't report on this, and I was like, thank God you guys have me, because that would have been so embarrassing. But all these outlets, like a ton, even after I went on this tweet rant about, or informative rant about what adoption is and what it's not, and why it's important to have these discussions about not knowing anything about Indigenous people. But all these, outlets reported that she was adopted into the Gitxsan Nation, which there's concerns that Indigenous people have about that already, right? Like, why is Joseph Boyden adopted into, 20 different Indigenous nations? And why does Justin Trudeau have a headdress? And why does Stephen Harper get adopted? And then a bunch of Indigenous people still have issues with identity and belonging, right? So going back to your question about who do you write for? So for me, I was doing a web story about what is an adoption? Who gets adopted? It was so challenging. And I ended up dropping the story because I had to keep on going back to the people in my story. And it was so embarrassing because they're like, you don't know anything about your culture. And I'm like, no, it's just, I have to make it so that this white audience can understand, because I'm constantly having the, other people say, well, no one knows what 60 Scoop is still. And I'm like, really? I have to, like, so, you know, a few years ago, I was like, what is residential school? Like, you can't just put that out there. Like, you have to explain what that is. So you're taking up this huge part of your story to explain for non-Indigenous people what is boilerplate to us is. And it just takes up so much space to have to explain all of that. And, you know, when we write stories, at least for my outlet, we don't assume that people are going to just go off and Google. We want to have everything in there. So it was just like this reminder, like, who I'm writing for. And I'm writing for a very broad audience, but I'm expecting people to know very, very little about Indigenous people. I'm not writing for Indigenous people. If I were, I could do this beautiful story about, you know, that didn't have to go, what is a smokehouse? Like, I had to explain what a feast hall is. And I was just like, and they're like, Angela, you don't even know what this is? And I'm like, you have to, and they're like, people should know what a feast hall is. And I'm like, but they don't. So that's a real challenge for me, to have to take up all that space and do it in creative ways. But always having that in the back of my head. Given that though, knowing what our history has been in mainstream media, for me, it's always important, and going back to what Steph said, to have an Indigenous expert. So I'm not going to have a white anthropologist talking about Squamish Nation land or Stanley Park's history or a feast hall or a pandemic or a scientific theory. You know, I'm always going to push really hard to make sure, at least in my column, those are Indigenous people who are the experts, who are the lawyers, who are the anthropologists and the archaeologists, who are the scientists. And that's interesting, because sometimes I feel like those aren't the big stories, because people are gonna be like more interested in what a white CEO has to say about Squamish land and development than an elder who's, you know, been passed this knowledge on for her entire life, generations back. So so my audience in my head is Indigenous people, like, you know, this is also for healing for our community, for, you know, finally seeing accurate portrayals of us. But also in the back of my head, it's like, this is not just Indigenous people reading this. And so you need to kind of spoon feed so many different things, which is annoying, but it's a reality. So, you know, taking into consideration that this is education for some, and this is something else for a number of other people.
Yeah, it is kind of a constant struggle or balance, like you're describing, because it kind of like like assuming objectivity is a good thing in journalism. So often the assumption is that that the audience is white and that's who you're writing for. And it might be true that a lot of the audience is white, but it's so often just the assumption, and like, will a white person understand this if they read it? It's like the guiding principle. And but it's hard because, yeah, like you want, like, I'm always trying to think, like, am I empowering myself and being true to what I know while I write this, and also being empowering and true to the people that are in this story, the Indigenous people and communities that are in here. And not just explaining, like you said, things that are basic to Indigenous people. Am I not just, is this literally just to explain this to white people, or am I also doing something more? Like Angela said, there's always that education piece, but is it like always trying to do more than that as well? And serving the people that you're covering can be really, really, really hard to get them both. And I do often write things that will be caught in editing too, where I'm just like, well, everyone knows this, and then they're like, oh, you should explain this, and I'm like, but I don't want to. Like, yeah, so it's a constant struggle, and I can't even say really yeah, like the proper way to deal with it. I still feel like I'm just so new, kind of wading into this journalism world and kind of finding that balance all the time. And the other thing, just for the Narwhal as a publication, is, yeah, very environmentally focused, reader funded for the most part, along with grants and other funding, but the majority of it comes from reader funding. And So in that way, a lot of the work, you know, like Carol just put it this way the other day, she's saying, we don't have to worry about whether a story gets 100 clicks or 100,000 clicks, like we still will just write what we think needs to be covered. So that's really special to be able to write somewhere like that. And I guess one of the things too, just that since it's so focused on the natural world and the intersections of how industry impacts communities and the land, and just always kind of talking about the things in kind of those three contexts, the environment, industry, and the communities, the people that live there and that are impacted, it does mean that a lot of our stories just have kind of that narrower focus. So the stories that I've written to do with COVID are also always kind of balanced with, you know, what is industry trying to get away with during COVID? What projects are they trying to push through? Things like food security and sustainability. It's kind of always through that lens. So it adds this other level of keeping an eye on things that are being less covered now. You know, what environmental requirements are being decreased right now, and what companies are laying off monitoring staff, and who's pushing referrals and who's getting audited. Once again, all that's happening on Indigenous territories and First Nations are involved, and just really trying to also keep up on those things that they don't just kind of pass by without ever being covered or kind of widely known.
Yeah, what you're both saying about how to navigate audience issues it really resonates with a lot of the research I've done. And I wonder how you guys think about concepts like harm and where accountability is, and if that's different because you are part of Indigenous communities. I just finished this co-authored book with my UBC colleague, Mary Lynn Young, and one of the things we found, or we did a whole chapter in which we interviewed Angela for, we interviewed Angela along with a number of Indigenous journalists for this chapter, really, which looked at how Indigenous journalists are kind of doing their work and what it means to kind of confront, you know, journalism norms like objectivity. You know, Desmond Cole has been tweeting and also writing a lot about this too, and I think it really comes to the fore when Indigenous communities are protesting and defending their lands. And so how you think about that in relation to COVID, I think is really interesting too, because you know, there's been so much written about, and so many Indigenous communities have talked about all the harm from prior journalisms and where journalists have made mistakes. You know, we're at the just over the 1 year mark of the MMIWG report, which Angela mentioned, and you know, has media done its job? Have they been accountable to you know, the many families who contributed to that report and to the commission? It's the same thing with COVID. How do you think about accountability to the communities that you're reporting on, but also really addressing the harms and the challenges of working with journalism norms and methods? You know, the work of dealing with being both a professional journalist and being part of Indigenous communities where there is significant accountability for what you're doing and how you're contributing to public conversations. So maybe Steph or Angela, whichever one of you wants to go first.
Yeah, there's so much there for me to kind of kind of process and unpack and think about. But yeah, it's something that is definitely always on my mind, that we're working in a medium and in an industry that, like all other systems in Canada, has been developed in a colonial context. And you know, like journalism was built as another colonial institution, and now we're working within it, and once again having to question these norms that we take for granted. And thinking about harm is something I think about just all the time, because there's other ideals of journalism, like something you always hear, sort of like a cliche, is if like everyone who you wrote about is like unhappy in the story, then you did your job. Like if you're writing, and it's like, how is that? What? Why is that something that we want to do? Why do we want to walk away and make everyone feel misrepresented? Why is that an ideal? And so it's really hard to kind of just like, we were told those things by people in the industry and in school, and before ever going into school, kind of like told those ideals, and that's what you see in movies. That's what journalists do. And to try to do it differently goes against a bunch of the other norms, like taking more time, or like Angela was talking about, just being like, you know what, actually, this story isn't the right thing for me to do, and like just having to make those decisions in an industry that really doesn't welcome that kind of thing. And so, as for accountability to communities, yeah, with every single thing that I write, I feel just, yeah, extremely accountable. And yeah, it's something that's always on my mind. And I feel like today I saw an article that was saying that Ottawa has delayed a national action plan to like tackle systemic racism against Indigenous people, and they say it's because of COVID. And even just something like that, like I've just read about it one place, I just saw that came out today. But I was just thinking, you know, after seeing a spike in racism against Indigenous people due to COVID, and also violence against Indigenous people during the Wet'suwet'en raid in February, coming up to the 1-year anniversary of the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and just seeing a spike in racism everywhere against people of color, and then just saying, oh, actually, this is something that we can delay. But then other things like industry were essential, you know, and kind of just thinking about what we prioritize. And, you know, after the widely read op-ed was just published questioning where racism manifests in Canada, you know, and like just the harm that coverage causes, and how to come up against that, you know, how, like, we can't stop stuff like that still being written, apparently. So that's something that's always on my mind too, like how to change norms like that in the industry. Like it's still kind of beyond me, like how did that get published? I don't know. That's all my thoughts.
Yeah, I love that point. I mean, I don't know if it's so specific to COVID, but like, yeah, somebody said that to me once, like everyone, I actually never went to journalism school. I actually was rejected from UBC journalism school. Yes.
Huge mistake. Let's just, before my time. I never went to J school either, though.
You didn't? Oh, it can happen. But so a lot of the stuff, it was like learning along the ways and being like, what's a junket? But yeah, somebody said that to me about my story about newborn babies being apprehended. They said, you know, how you do a good story is, you know, everyone's angry. And this is like an Indigenous woman who had her baby taken away, who has like tremendous, she's had to deal with a lot in terms of colonization, residential school, her mom went to 2, and a lot of mental health from that, and just like having one's babies ripped away is traumatizing more than like any woman can imagine. And to write a story that I'm hoping she is upset with is not like, why would I do that? I was so dumbfounded, and it kept on going through my head. And I don't know if I wrote something to the editor, if I just was like, what? And she said, actually, maybe not, you know. And but going back to about harm during COVID in Indigenous communities, and I think this goes for when you're doing any story, but you're thinking about so much more. So I wrote about a guy who was a survivor of COVID in Alert Bay. I published a story, but I'm thinking about so many more things than just, you know, I don't know if I would be thinking about things like, you know, how is he going to get bullied? And he told me that, like, people are talking smack about him and don't go near him, and such a small community. And then, so I'm thinking about all these different things and his culture, and, you know, these are things that I'm just thinking about, that these are balls that are in the air while I'm writing this story. And then when there's a death, you just have to be very, very careful, because our communities, I find anyways, and I don't know if I'm misrepresenting all other people, but there's a lot of deaths in our communities. And me and my friend were just talking about this last night. It's not that there are a lot of deaths, but there's also that we consider, we look at kin in different ways. So someone might have lost a second cousin, which I did, my uncle Neil Sterritt, and some people might be just like, oh, it's just your second cousin, or, you know, but for us, we have a greater responsibility as Indigenous people to take care of those extended family members who we see as sisters. You know, I was always taught we don't have cousins or second cousins, like they're just your cousins, or they're your sister or your brother. And so these are our close relations. And so we see death in very different ways and in very significant ways. So yeah, during COVID, there's just things that I'm really mindful of and careful of. And that's the way that I deal with, I think, any story about Indigenous people. And one of the things that I've always been told is, like, in particular by Indigenous women who've lost a loved one who's been missing or murdered or been murdered, is you're so different. You're so different than other reporters. Like, thank you so much. And trusting me and speaking out for the first time. And I'm always like, what am I, like, I'm literally just asking questions and being gentle, and also letting them know, like, I've got the parole documents. You don't need to give me all the, you know, egregious details, you know, some which are just completely brutal. And that's it. So I went to a shoot with a reporter, senior reporter, top notch, and we were a little bit under resourced. So one of us had to take pictures and one of us had to ask the questions. And I said, well, you know, you're the, you know, the top investigative reporter, I'll take the pictures. And this was a woman who was in labor, who was afraid her baby was going to get taken away. And it was just right out of the gate, do you use drugs or alcohol? No, not even a beer. What about a wine? And the woman's like, I'm pregnant. Like, I'm 9 months pregnant. Well, what about before that? Like, any kind of, and this went on for, like, it's on tape for like 8 minutes, just drugs and alcohol, drugs and alcohol, drugs and alcohol, abuse of your partner. And we had nothing. We had, what's your baby's name going to be? Like, are you excited? Like, you're going to be a mom. And like, how are, you know, what's your community? Where are you from? What's your, you know, nothing. We couldn't even use it. We couldn't use any of that, because all it was no, 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 you know. And I'm like, that's what we do differently, right? And I've listened to other interviews, and I'm not saying Indigenous reporters are better, even interviewing Indigenous people, other Indigenous people, but sometimes I think that there's just those old school rules that you talked about, like, you want to make everyone feel upset with your story, or you know, you got to just ask them the questions, and you're a journalist, you're objective, and you have no feelings, you're just there as the questioning person. You're not, you know, you can't show emotions, and don't nod your head. And you know, my photographer took a picture of me doing an interview, and my face was just like so upset, and I was like, oh my God. But then I was like, you know what, I think it's okay in this time to let people know that we're also human beings who, especially as Indigenous people, when we're doing stories about other Indigenous women being brutalized and hurt, it's okay to feel that, and we do. And, you know, talking about objectivity, and everyone has a view, and everyone puts those views in their stories, whether they like to admit it or not. And so, yeah, there's a different way that I think Indigenous reporters, at least me, thinks about the harm that we're causing, not just what the story published will be like. You know, I would never show anyone my story before it got published. You know, even pictures or anything, but during the interview, it's just a different process, I think, that we're always considering and acknowledging these traumas that people have even faced as a result of past media experiences.
Thank you both. I have a business item to just insert here. So we're just coming up to the top of the hour. And if you have to leave, we're going to go to 11:30 Pacific time. But if you need to leave, we just wanted to let you know that, and someone's going to put up a slide here. I'm just going to let you know, if you leave the call, this is being recorded, and the video from this and the series that this is part of, the webinars, is available online, and you can see on this slide how to get there. And my apologies to the Indigenous Research Support Initiative. We're so used to acronyms here, I forget sometimes what they actually, what words they are, but we're really grateful for IRSI, Indigenous Research Support Initiative, and the Learning Circle for hosting this today and organizing it and bringing us all together. So those are the websites that you go to for this webinar and the other two that are part of this series, looking at Indigenous research, Indigenous journalism as it relates to the pandemic. All right, so I want to turn a little bit to some questions from the audience that I think are really relevant to what we've been discussing today. From Bob, he asks, much of the discussion lately in light of what's going on in the US and elsewhere is about how potential allies who truly want to help or make a difference should approach victims of racism to see how they can do something to make a difference. So I've seen concerns about how approaching the victim potentially makes them relive the trauma. What are your thoughts? And obviously this is a discussion that we often have in journalism and in ethics kinds of conversations about how to report on and talk to people about trauma. So leave it to both or one of you, depending on who wants to respond.
Can you just repeat the last part of the question again?
Yeah, I have seen concerns about how approaching the victim potentially makes them relive the trauma. What are your thoughts? So basically somebody who wants to be an ally and help and talk to people who've experienced racism, racist behavior, racist treatment. So how do you think about that in your journalism in terms of like the woman that is, you know, giving birth and afraid of having her baby removed? How do you begin to think about talking to people who've experienced trauma?
I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, one of the things that I'm learning when we're seeing so much discussion alive right now about anti-Black racism is that, and I mean, this is me speaking not about a journalist, but as a journalist as well, but is just to shut up and listen and take direction from Black people, and also take the criticism with humility. And that's hard when you're a journalist. I feel like as journalists, sometimes we have this thing like, well, we know everything. We're the experts. We're the researchers. We've gone through the documents and we talk to people, but we don't. And that's okay to admit and say, oh, I'm so sorry. I did not know that. And that's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of us, I think, who are, we're poised as experts, or the ones to go to for the information, or the gatekeepers of information. And so through this, I'm just like, okay, I need to take a big piece of humble pie. So yeah, I know I'm not talking about the harm anymore, but there was a guest on our radio show the other day who was a Black woman and being asked about what can white people do, essentially. And she said, take out your iPhone right now and look it up, because I'm not going to be the one to educate you and cause myself exhaustion and cause myself more harm. And I do feel like even as a journalist, it's hard when people say, what can I do to help you? And so during this time right now, when we're really talking about anti-Black racism, I'm really just listening and doing a lot of Googling. And, for example, the Black Squares thing was happening, and I kept on seeing all the white people I know posting them. And then I was like, and then I was seeing people in my community posting them with an apology. And then I Googled it and I was like, oh, like the people in the Black community don't want this to happen because it's clogging up the hashtag. So people are going to the hashtag and it's going to a Black square instead of messages about how you can help, right? So like, listen before you see, a mass movement telling you to do the opposite. And also, I don't go to friends of mine who are Black and be like, how can I help? I check in and I say, how are you doing? You don't need to answer. Just know that I'm sending you good thoughts. And I think for me as a journalist, I need to do more of that right now. I need to do more of like listening, apologizing when it's appropriate, and not expecting other people to inform my my education, and doing a lot of that on my own. Yeah.
Steph, do you want to add to that, or do you want to move on to the next question?
I just found something really brief. I don't feel like I have as much knowledge to share yet. I agree with everything Angela was saying about just shut up and listen. It's like the best advice for most situations. For most people. I just wanted to share something I heard from Michelle Stevenson, a filmmaker who was a visiting professor at UBC. Just something that she said that really stuck with me about talking about trauma as a journalist, like in an interview setting. And basically she was saying, you know, like not to take the pain and the crying and like if someone cries, like basically not to take that as, oh, we have to stop, you know, like not going out of your way to drive someone to cry and check in with them, but also if it gets uncomfortable, not then shying away from it, because it doesn't mean just because the person is going through pain doesn't mean that they don't want to talk about it. It can be emotionally overwhelming for them to talk about, but basically just giving them the agency to decide whether they want to continue, taking the time to let them decide, giving the person the agency to decide if they want to continue or not, was something that kind of stuck with me, because we were talking about specifically with documentary filmmaking, which is something that she's like an expert in and I wanted to learn more about. And so, yeah, I think that was something that really stuck with me. Emotion itself is not a bad thing and not a thing to shy away from. Once again, still not saying don't try to push the person to a breaking point, which is something that journalism has been guilty of doing before. But just giving the person agency if you are going into those kind of tough subject matters.
Really good advice. I want to take another question here from Gary, who I think this speaks to some of the broader connections with Black communities and communities of color. He asks, when people like Bryan Adams recently and Don Cherry last year speak out against immigrants, how are they perpetuating racism against Indigenous people and continuing the doctrine of discovery, which for those of you who aren't aware was a doctrine handed out by the Catholic Church, which sort of made it so that settlers could come here and claim land, and Indigenous people were considered less than human, or at least not agents of their land, and with extremely complex governance systems and trading relations and all of the things that we know to be true about our own communities and our histories here on this continent. So again, it's sort of connecting what's happening when immigrants are being treated in racist ways, being talked about in ways that don't respect them, and does that also perpetuate racism against Indigenous people?
Whew, that could get into a really complicated academic conversation, which I don't like to do. But I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of crossover, but I also am learning right now, you know, somebody called me out on Twitter. I don't know if they were calling me out, but they were calling out the idea when we're making comparisons right now about, you know, basically people who are saying right now, you know, there's a sentiment like, oh, we're not racist in Canada. We're not like the US. And then people saying, oh, you know, yes, we are. Look at the Indigenous people. And someone was basically saying that was an erasure of the historic and ongoing racism, anti-Black racism. So that's kind of like where my head is at right now. I often try to draw comparisons or things like that, but right now I'm in this different mode where just we need to not erase one experience to uplift another or to shine awareness on the other. So I'm probably not the best person to ask for that, because I'm trying to sit with that right now, because I got called out sort of to speak on that. Yeah, and I think erasure is a powerful thing, right? So when we're talking about new immigrants coming to Canada, I mean, white people are immigrants as well, but when we're talking about new immigrants, a lot of them come here and they don't know anything about Indigenous people. That's at least what they've told me. Or they're told by people when they arrive here, like, don't hang out with Indigenous people, you know, they're lazy, all the stereotypes. So yeah, there's a lot to say about that, but I think it's maybe a different conversation, or something that I'm not able to talk about in this current moment.
Steph, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I would just broadly say that, like, I agree with Angela, not kind of lumping everything into one bucket or putting one conversation over another. It does, to me, it is evidence just basically that that racism is alive and well, and also that that these kind of people just basically perpetuate the myth that Canada is white, and that's a myth that is very long standing and that some people like may hold very dearly, especially the someone like Don Cherry, or people who are voicing these racist things. And I guess the only other thing is also it perpetuates the idea that that ignorance is a point of view. That was something that I really liked that Brock Penawanaquat actually said on Media Indigenous as well. I've been listening to it a lot lately, if people can't tell. But basically he said, like, it's important to not take ignorance as a point of view.
Yeah, wise words from Brock. And, you know, I guess the other thing I would add to this is that there are Black and Indigenous people and communities, and Black or Asian and Chinese and Indigenous people here in our province, right? So, you know, there's a lot of people with multiple identities who can add to this conversation, and I think in really interesting ways. And one of the most powerful images I've seen recently is two arm in arm, and one says Black liberation and the other says Indigenous sovereignty. And I think, like, walking together and amplifying Black voices where and when, you know, as much as possible, I think it has been really important, at least for me in my learning as well. And, you know, something I've been doing pretty much consistently on Twitter for the last several days is just really turning it over to Black voices to really speak directly to what's happening and how they're navigating the current situation. And how they're thinking about the past. You know, much of what we do as Indigenous people who speak into the public is really thinking about how the past so much informs what we're dealing with in the present. So I want to also move back to COVID specifically. One of the questions from Flora, which I think was something I thought about right away as soon as COVID started happening, and just acknowledging Navajo Nation has incredibly disproportionate rates of COVID, but also have you know, problems with water supply and access to clean water in some parts of their nation's land. So the question from Flora is, many Indigenous communities lack usable, reliable sources of clean water. Sort of how are these communities coping? And I wonder if either of you have thought about that in your journalism as well.
I mean, definitely when I was pitching stories about the fears of COVID entering communities, I thought, or I talked about that, like when they said, well, why is this important? Why are they raising this? And Indigenous people and community, you know, talk to me about not having the infrastructure, right? And not, you know, being removed and put on reserves that are remote, far. in some cases far away, in some cases, in most cases, just don't have the same kind of infrastructure like clean drinking water, hospitals. And so, yeah, that was something that I definitely talked about and touched on. I haven't done any reporting on that in depth about how that's affecting communities because no one has brought that to me. And I think it's also really important to point out that in the COVID conversations, I find a lot of this has been really focused on reserves. And it's almost like an easy go-to for reporters, right? Like, it's like, oh, this is a much easier conversation when we're talking about inequalities. Like, it's concrete, no, in many cases, no access to clean drinking water, no hospitals, no ventilators, higher rates of compromised immune systems, more elders, but it's harder as journalists to go to the city where most Indigenous people are today. Those are the statistics. There's, I think 70% of Indigenous people now live in urban centers. And what are the concerns there? Is it the same? Is it overcrowding? Is it poverty? Or are we going back to what Stephanie said, like, let's just always talk about Indigenous people as vulnerable people, right? Instead of leaders on this, instead of, why aren't we talking about two Indigenous nurses who are, and so going through that and some of the things that are easy for journalists, or make a good story, make good compelling radio or TV. And so sometimes that balance is lacking, and sometimes Indigenous people in the cities are being left out. And again, it goes back to, I think, invisibility, right? And so, yeah, just wanted to point that out, and also like take ownership for that. That's something that's a deficit in my own reporting that I've struggled with.
I don't have too much to add to that. Just kind of just basically agreeing with what Angela said. I think that she kind of covered it.
One of the questions I have, I'm going to go back to my own question for a second, is about how do you navigate the fear factor? There was a great article put out by a journalism scholar who talked about how media coverage really used fear and afraid to a great extent. And I think, like, this is also really relevant to what you've both been saying about how Indigenous communities have their own experts. They also have their own solutions, and they have a resilient history. I think back to Kim Tallbear, who's on the Media Indigena podcast and a faculty at U of A, a pretty well-known Indigenous scholar, who tweeted out sort of a few days into COVID, this is not unprecedented. This is precedented for Indigenous communities. We've dealt with these really difficult pandemic situations in our, very recent past. And so I wonder how you guys think about fear, given that that has been the predominant approach to COVID reporting by much of mainstream media, globally and within Canada.
Well, going back to what you were saying about this is precedented, I've actually found that challenging in my reporting. I haven't found those voices. And, as a journalist, I'm always hyper aware of myself doing what's called confirmation bias. Like, I think this, so I'm going to go look for that. And I don't really want to do that. Like, I want to find the elder who says what I think is happening, but I'm not hearing that. I'm not hearing that from Indigenous elders at all, that, not to be fearful because we've got this. I don't think we had that. We lost tons of people, millions in the smallpox epidemic. Like, Haida lost 80% of their population. Like, I don't think I think some of that is our own, we want to believe that our people are going to be leaders in this, but our people were crushed by epidemics, and our people lost a lot. And then there was colonization, and those two things, which went hand in hand in many ways, put us at a huge disadvantage to be that leader voice that if there's voices out there that, you know, if there's elders out there who say, no, you're wrong, we did have this, and I want to share how we got through this, how we survived, then I want to hear that. But I haven't heard that, and I've tried. Yeah, and you had that sort of comment, and then there was a question. Sorry, I kind of went off on my own tangent, but what was the question in there?
Oh, about how the predominant approach among most mainstream media is about generating fear. So how you navigate that.
Yeah, and I mean, this is me not speaking as a journalist for a moment. This is because I find fear is like human, right? We're human. I found some of the conversations around not fearing what I've been taught is called toxic positivity. So you don't need to be fearful. We can just go out, and if we don't have fear, we're not going to get COVID. And people were telling me this as I was watching people get COVID in communities and not have access to resources. And, you know, maybe that's great that you can not not have fear, and you have all you need in your home or your community, and you got a hospital, you've got ambulances, and you know, your immune system's really strong and you've got this. But I think we have fear in our human structure to protect us. And we have a lot of fear in our communities, but I think some of that fear is sort of relevant, right? It's a survival mechanism to protect us. It's why we tell our kids, you know, we have scary stories that are built into our cultures to keep our kids out of the woods, you know. And you know, I just feel like sometimes modern day society is just caught up in things that, you know, we're losing some of our why we have things like fear and why we need to protect ourselves. And so, yeah, I found that conversation around like, we don't need to fear. Sometimes it's like the toxic positivity, but and I also heard this at the beginning when CBC and other outlets were reporting and saying, you're fear mongering. And I kind of felt that too, but then it was real. Right? So in March, you heard tons of people slamming CBC. Why are you reporting on COVID so much? This is fear mongering. And I was like that too. And some of my friends were like, no, I think this is real. And it was. So I have a hard time, and hopefully Steph has a different perspective on this, because I'm kind of like, sometimes you need to be afraid and protect yourself and do what you can to self-isolate or not go outside and be very different, you know. And that's another thing I've learned about this, about people who are saying we need to still go to sweat lodges. Well, sometimes elders have told me that cultures survive when they adapt. And that's something that's been missing out of this conversation, I found. And again, I don't want to keep on going to people who are going to confirm what I think, but that's what I've been told, is that cultures, in order to survive and thrive, need to adapt to the changing environment around us. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the media for sure has been guilty of fear mongering before. Yeah, but I agree. Like, yeah, there was a huge shift in at first saying that the media was fear mongering, and then realizing the reality of COVID-19 and how far it was going to spread and how many people it was going to harm and kill. And so so I think that it's something that we're going to be talking about for a really long time. Like, also how much fear like the government told us to feel, you know, there's already so much conversation around that. So I think something we will be talking about for a really long time. I think that, yeah, fear is a human emotion, and for sure, yeah, can be helpful, because then you try to protect yourself. I suppose just in context of everything else we've been talking about fear and complicating it, not acting like it's a simple thing, you know, fear, but with agency, or with fear and preparing, and, you know, very capably preparing for the next step. rather than just being debilitated by fear, I suppose. But yeah, I think another thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately that's like not totally related, but is semi-related, is also just the way that that our own fear is framed in media storytelling. You know, how the fears of one person may be written off and the fear of another person may be amplified, and you know what fear is seen as legitimate or not is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. So yeah, I think that it's definitely going to be an ongoing conversation that that will continue through COVID.
Yeah. So I want to, we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to move to a question that actually is near and dear to my heart as well. It's from Amber, who introduced us. She asks, can we hope to hear the stories about COVID experiences for urban Indigenous people? Curious about how people are dealing with the complications about fearing the city and the desire to return home and return to community while realizing it could be dangerous for the elders to do so. And I say this because most of us who are from what is now called British Columbia are salmon people, and the salmon are going to start running soon up north, and there's going to be a lot of desire, pressure, obligation to rejoin our communities. So I'm curious about you know, whether or not you guys have thought about those stories, but also whether you've heard other concerns like this.
Do you want to go, Steph?
Sure. This is actually something that came up a lot when I was reporting on the food security issue, because it was about going out to fish and hunt and harvest, and there are definitely some concerns there. Like I was speaking to Chief Rick McLean up from Taltan, and he was basically saying, and once again, this was a while ago, but he was basically saying, we're really asking like people to not come home. Like we're too worried about having the resources if there's an outbreak up here, but knowing that that's a really hard thing to ask of people. And like Chief Louis, I was speaking to as well for the story from the Okanagan Indian band, and he was saying basically speaking to the history, saying in history, he was saying that people, when the pandemics kind of started to arrive, ran away and therefore spread it further. So he was saying we have to learn from that and stay put. And once again, as hard as that is. So those are two perspectives I heard from them as they were trying to prepare from their own perspectives. But it is a really hard thing to ask of people, because it's also it's a mode of wellness too, right? It's a mode of health, and it sounds like there are healthy ways to do it and to socially distance while you do so. And I guess it's just about enforcing that and making sure that everyone has the knowledge they need to do it safely.
Yeah. What I found really interesting was how different communities were handling that, because people want to go home and they have a right to go home, you know, in non-COVID times in particular, and connect with their family and their culture, the land. And I found, you know, in asking community about that, I was talking to not Alert Bay, but another community further north, and then Bella Bella. And I was like, what are you going to do when people want to come home? Or, you know, right now people are, you know, harvesting herring eggs on kelp, for example. And this is their economy, right? This is their only revenue stream. And they were very flexible and understanding around that. There was no sort of absolutes except for outsiders coming in, like people not from the community. And I have found Indigenous people, you know, taking leadership on this and saying, okay, I'm going back, I'm looking for a cabin or something where I can self-isolate for the 14 days and then come out, and people posting about that. And I think that's been really helpful in showing leadership of how it can be done, but it's kind of in the vein of privilege a bit too, right? Like who has a second home or So, and a lot of these things are in the vein of privilege when we're talking about these rules, which again, I think are very important. We need to do that to protect each other, but you know, stay inside, stay at home. Well, what about if you're homeless and you don't have a home to go to? And I wasn't thinking about that at first. I was just, yeah, everyone stay home. Like, what's your problem? And then it's like, oh, right. Some people can't do that. And so how do we navigate that? And I think, yeah, I think I've seen leadership. I've definitely also seen, yeah, people just sort of doing what they always did and ignoring the rules. And that's been really disheartening to see Indigenous people go plandemic. If people don't know that there's a video out there called Plandemic that's purporting this idea that COVID-19 is a conspiracy. So I've heard a bit of that from Indigenous people, not a lot, but that's kind of disheartening and hard to see. But I've also seen Indigenous people take leadership and say, you know, I mean, I'm going to home for the summer to fish or just to be with my family, but I'm going to self-isolate. And when I'm there, I'm going to, you know, follow all the other protocols. So, and seeing communities take that into consideration. And I definitely have seen people harvesting and selling in the city, like going from community to community. So yeah, a lot of it's concerning, but I think it's possible, but these are things we need to learn about how to live in this new normal, because this isn't the end of it. At least we've been told that from the authorities.
Just one last question to round out our discussion today. So this is from Alexa. What are some steps, due diligence that non-Indigenous people should do to ensure that the news we share about Indigenous people and communities is accurate? Maybe 1 or 2 minutes from you each on that.
That's a really hard one, right? Because you trust media, you trust that they've fact checked, you trust that they've had their editorial leaders take a look at it. So that's actually really hard. I mean, as a rule, I always tell people who are going to be interviewed by media, like, make sure you know who that reporter is, look at their past stories, find out, you know, if their stories have been riddled with inaccuracies about Indigenous people, find out if they've done a number of Indigenous stories over the years, find out if they've learned lessons from not so good reporting. But yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, but that would be my suggestion is, and follow as many Indigenous reporters as you can, and people who do Indigenous stories on a regular basis and are, you know, respected by Indigenous people. But it's really hard to fact check if you don't know. So yeah, that would be my main piece of advice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I feel like I almost need to double check. Sorry, the question was about what was more from the perspective of what journalists should do, or what?
Yeah, what audience non-Indigenous people should do to make sure that the stories they're sharing are accurate.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Doing research on the outlet and on the reporter who's writing it, for sure. Try to follow a diversity of reporters, like finding people you trust and sharing their content and supporting their work, and actually getting to know reporters rather than just sharing, this is a CBC article, like, you know, like who at CBC, there's many people at CBC, so like who's writing it? And I think the same as what Angela was talking about earlier, confirmation bias, like what news are you seeking out? Are you seeking out news that just confirms what you already believe, or are you seeking out stuff that you think is expanding your viewpoint? Are you supporting you know, a variety of outlets? Just kind of, yeah, just really questioning, what are you consuming? What do you know? What do you not know about this? What question did this article not answer for you? And just kind of just asking yourself more questions, and also being critical of what you're reading.
Thank you so much, Madhu, to both of you. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I appreciate you taking time from your work and life schedules, which are all in one now for all of us for the foreseeable future. So a huge thank you to both of you, and a big thank you to the Learning Circle and IRSI, Indigenous Research Support Initiative, for organizing this and supporting it. And you will be able to rewatch this or send it to other people to watch, because it will be stored online at either of the websites that you see on the screen right now. So yeah, again, this has been a really great conversation. And if you have not been paying attention to Angela or Steph's work, you should be. They're doing excellent work as journalists, and I am grateful that they are contributing to our understanding of Indigenous communities and of our communities at large here in our province and beyond.
Thank you, Candis, and to all the hosts again.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting us, Candis, and the Learning Circle as well. Thank you, Steph. I love your work, and it was really great to hang out with you and for all the questions as well.